Welcome to Three Count Commentaries. This is your boy MongoSlade. And we're going to talk about Dark Side of the Ring, Nick Gage. And this is a subject I don't know a lot about. I don't know a lot about Nick Gage. Matter of fact, I didn't know that much of anything about outside of him being a deathmatch wrestler. So this was very enlightening as far as, a trip down his life and, looking at some of his more infamous moments. And I don't have the horrible negativity towards Nick Gage that I had towards New Jack, only because I didn't know who he was. So I was learning about him and learning his sympathetic story as we go along. But the amount of hero worship for Nick Gage is really troublesome. It's troublesome. I'll talk about that at the end. But let's just go through the episode now. So John Moxley was in here basically being a cheerleader for Nick Gage, saying absolutely absurd things. But I like that Jericho says that deathmatch wrestling is like a live action horror movie. As the narrator, this is what Jericho says. It's a live action horror movie. Huh. So I guess it's full of jump scares, people in masks. Well, I guess that explains it. It's like a slasher film, sure. You're hitting people in the head with pizza with cheese graters and pizza slicers and fluorescent light tubes. I guess it is kind of a horror movie. It's kind of a modern horror movie. Horror movies of the past were very psychological. It was very scary. Now they're kind of gross out films. So I guess you can say that. Modern horror, with the exception of certain things like Saw, is still very psychological in certain ways. I don't know. I saw the first one. I think I may have seen the first two. I'm not really a horror movie guy, but a lot of horror movies have just turned into slasher films, like Nightmare on Elm Street and all that kind of stuff, where it's just blood and guts and ridiculous stuff, and there's little to no plot, there's little to no reason for any of it to be happening. So I guess deathmatch wrestling is kind of like a horror movie. So that was on that was on point. So Moxley says that deathmatch wrestlers are some of the best storytellers, and they are really good at connecting with an audience. Later in the episode, that he says that Vince McMahon would kill to have one person on his roster that has the connection with the audience that Nick Gage has. And then he says that Nick Gage is like a folk hero. He's a, and you know what? I can see there's some truth into the concept of him being a folk hero. That much is for sure, but I typically look at it more like he is a garage band, and everybody likes him because he's a garage band, and it's like, well, I could do that too, and there's a certain level of that goes with it, that a certain level of intimacy that the ECW audience used to have with guys like Sandman and Sabu, and there was a certain level of that, so a certain level of exclusivity that he's our guy. And because he's our guy, he represents us, he speaks for us or whatever. There's a certain level of that, and that's kind of what folk heroes do. They represent a culture. And I've been talking a lot about, heroes and stuff like that. And they come in all shapes and sizes. Nick Gage being a toothless, quite, goof, meth addict, heroin addict, oxy addict. I mean, pro wrestling, for starters, they just manufacture drug addicts. So that's not a knock against him. That's just the business that he's in. But I don't like deathmatch wrestling. But for the people who do like it, maybe they are, very in the camp, the MDK, murder, death, kill camp. And, they see Nick Gage as a folk hero. And I can see it, because a folk hero is supposed to represent the folk, the people, the folks that are in that culture. And if he represents the people in that culture, then I can't say he doesn't. I'm not in that culture. I don't support deathmatch wrestling. It's stupid. So it's up to the people who are in it. And if Moxley is a guy who's got some stroke, and I did look after I watched the Dark Side of the Ring. I went and looked. And a lot of people who are into deathmatch wrestling do truly believe that he is some type of Superman because he died and then came back. He's like a Jesus figure, you know? And that's a very weird story, man. That's a very strange archetypal story there, where you got a guy who got the call, the Joseph Campbell situation, where he got the call, then he had the wise man who helped him through the situation, then he faced his traumas, then he died and was resurrected, and he came back. He went to prison, came back and brought a boon to his people, which is, the blood, the sweat, the respect, the love that he went and that he put himself through, the horrors that he put himself through, rather. And then he was able to come back and bring that energy back to the audience, even after everything that he did. I think that does kind of make him a Christ-like figure, doesn't it? Baptized in blood, maybe? I mean, I'm not in the deathmatch cult. I'm just looking at things from an archetypal universal human story perspective. And as far as a universal human story, Nick Gage has a pretty good one. He was a wrestling fan when he was 9 years old. He gets into it with his brother. They didn't say whether his brother was older or younger. I'm thinking he's younger. And that they were two kids who, their parents were divorced or split up or whatever. And they watched wrestling with their dad. And they got really into, they were raised in the 80s, I think. So they used to watch Saturday Night's Main Event, and then they moved from there to something a little bit more mature with ECW and Japanese death matches, and they were inspired by that to doing their own backyard barbed wire death matches that they recorded on their home videos. Dark Side of the Ring did a good job of collecting that information and showing that stuff. Of course, it set them on the bad path, though, because guys feel like deathmatch wrestling. This is one of the things that Nick Gage says. He wanted to show that deathmatch wrestling is okay and it's a legitimate style. And whenever you tell people like deathmatch wrestling is bullshit, they'd be like, "Oh, look, Terry Funk did it. Mick Foley did it." They'll always talk about all the guys who laid around in the glass and the thumbtacks. But I always say, like, man, only like 4 of those guys ever made any real money. Most of those guys don't make shit. They end up dead. But this is something that this guy was into. He was into ECW. He was into CZW. Got started there, and he starts even talking about the ECW guys were offended. Now I don't know if it was there's been a lot of knockoffs of ECW, and sometimes in wrestling promotions use the same initials, but it's not the same promotion. Like when I looked up extra information on him, I saw that he used to work for a place called East Coast Championship or East Coast Wrestling or something like that. And I don't know if that's the ECW he was talking about. But he starts talking about, hey, all those people were pretty angry because of the fluorescent light tubes and all that kind of stuff. And he would say, like, you're just pissed because the younger generation are tougher and crazier than you. But I love that shit. And I was just kind of like, people thought the ECW guys were dumb. You go through people talk about a lot about dead wrestlers. Go through the ECW roster one time and see how many of those guys are dead today. Quite a few of them. The WWF roster, maybe back in the 80s and the early 90s, you watched like a, Survivor Series 1990 or something like that. Ton of fucking dead guys on it. Go watch an ECW show and try to find somebody on that motherfucker that's alive. You're probably looking at the fans, and Joey Styles, probably the only one, and Heyman, and Taz and Raven. They barely alive. Taz, Raven, and Shane Douglas, those guys are barely alive. A lot of the other guys on the show was fucking dead. But this was they talked a lot about stuff like that. They also talked about his mom, that his mom was his rock. And this is kind of where I started feeling sorry for him, well, not in a pity way, but just kind of in a way where I can relate. Because he lost his mom to breast cancer, his dad died, his brother committed suicide. These are different points of his life where he was dragged low, and he still manages to stay positive, and he still manages to bring positive energy to the wrestling shows and get positive energy in return. And he does seem to come across as very genuine, which is another good folk hero thing. Is sometimes you're not on a high horse where you're not over analyzing everything. You give people straight talk, they can appreciate it, and because it's coming from you, and they know it's not coming from a mean place, but it's coming from a real place. And there's a certain level of that I just got through the screen and sitting there watching him talk. There's a certain level of realness there. There was that, the street guy stuff. I can relate to that a little bit, but I don't like deathmatch wrestling. So he says that, him and his brother fell out before his brother committed suicide because he was so pilled out of his mind. They were supposed to have a match. And then, his brother smacked him during the match and then hit him with a finish, broke his shoulder and pinned him because his brother was so pissed that he was strung out all the time. And that was rough. That was rough. I would think, that was a tough deal because his brother is dead now and they didn't have much of a relationship. Apparently, when his brother died, they didn't have much of a relationship. And he seemed to have wanted that, but just never pursued it. And that's kind of a guy thing, where you kind of you want to make amends for something. You want to, build that bridge that might be burned, but it just never happened. But he talked about this. Basically, this began his downward spiral. He didn't have any family. He didn't have any friends. He was living with his girlfriend, and then they got kicked out of the apartment, or they got kicked out of her mother's house. She just put him out. He went and moved in with Brett Lauderdale and was sleeping on his floor. Then Brett Lauderdale comes home and sees this guy on the floor. He throws him out in the cold, and Nick Gage is like, "Fuck him for that." But that's a legitimate, real response. And then he said that kind of led with him to robbing the bank. And then he says, like, hey, the bank robbery. And he talked about the bank robbery where he walked into a store, then walked into the bank. He was going to rob another bank, and then he didn't do it. He pussied out. Then he goes to another bank. He hypes himself up, slaps himself on the face, and he goes in there with a note that says, "Give me the money or I'm going to shoot you." He gets $3,000 from the bank teller. He walks out with it, and he's on camera. And then I thought this was actually pretty funny because John Moxley noticed, and he was like, I was told to check my email. I check my email, and I see pictures of Nick fucking Gage robbing a bank with no mask on. And he's like, the son of a bitch wears a mask on his way to the ring. Like he wears a handkerchief over his face like he's a 1800s outlaw, like he's Jesse James or some shit about to rob a train. But when he decides to really rob the bank, he doesn't wear a mask. And then Nick Gage was like, man, that should tell you that I wasn't in my right mind when I did it. I was down, I was low. It was a spur of the moment thing. I just decided to do it because I was near this bank. Of course, it couldn't have been too much of a spur of the moment thing if he had a note and he was going to do it once and then he backed out. Wasn't that much of a spur of the moment thing. Some people don't pay attention to stuff like that, but I do. If it was spur of the moment, he'd have went into the first bank and did it. He had to talk himself into doing it. But he was saying like, he had this huge drug addiction. He was really into oxy and pain pills. And people was just giving him stuff because he was Nick Gage and he was famous, or they knew who he was. But he didn't realize how famous he was until he went to prison, which, to be quite honest, maybe him going to prison helped his gimmick, which I'm pretty sure is exactly what happened. But he starts, I think the story goes, he robbed the PNC Bank, with a letter. He had to pay, there was $150,000 bond for him. He ended up, obviously nobody's going to pay that. But he took the money, and him and his girlfriend went to Atlantic City. And From the stories that I read, they went and played roulette, and they went and hung out and spent $3,000, spent all of it. In Dark Side of the Ring, he talked about his sole objective was to spend all of that money to get rid of all of it. And he says he didn't care how long it took. And Brett Lauderdale said it took him about 8 days before he was ready to turn himself in. And then he went and got himself a Whopper, which I heard that he really likes. Really likes Whoppers. He's a man of taste. I like a good Whopper myself every now and again. I haven't had one in this year, due to shawarmas. Anyway, he drank a 40, smoked some blunts, then turned himself in. He had to do 4.5 years in prison. So that was tough because he got hit with 5 years. So he had to do 4.5 years in prison. He came out, got Brett Lauderdale, who is, I guess, his biggest fan, has started up GCW, Game Changer Wrestling, the company that actually gives money to Joey Janela. Ugh. Anyway, he had created the Nick Gage Invitational. I guess it's a deathmatch tournament. And Nick Gage was actually supposed to be in it, the first one. But then he got arrested for parole violation. He got busted trying to falsify urine. He had to do another 2 years. And then, so he lost about 6 years out of his career. And he was 30 when he robbed the bank. So he lost, 6 years out of his career. So from 30 to 36 or whatever, he was pretty much in prison. And, he was basically saying like, when he came out, he was, trying to get his life back in order, trying to get himself back on track. So I'll give him credit for that. Whenever somebody, accepts that they did something wrong, which he did, he pled guilty. What else could he do? He was as clear as day on screen, robbing the bank. But it says a lot that this guy was, a deathmatch star and was essentially homeless and broke at the height of his popularity. This wasn't some guy on the downslide. This wasn't some dude who was hot in the 80s. And then it's 1997 and he don't have any money. So now he's out here doing independent shows. This is a guy who was doing independent shows and was one of the most popular guys on the independents and was still fucking broke because he was, doing drugs and, all that stuff. So you have to ask the question, man, was it worth it? And I think he would say it was. You can't live life twice, though. But so let's talk about his career now. Some of the things that they talk about, some of the actual in-ring stuff. So he talked about John Moxley talked about the first death match they had. That him, a young John Moxley, got in the ring with Nick Gage, and that Nick Gage took a pizza cutter to his head and then sliced his tongue. And then talked about how intense the match was. And that this kind of intensity is what you live for. And he says, I do this not for the money, not for the fame. I do it for that feeling. And it's addictive. And that's the reason I think he does it. He has an addiction to the rush and the intensity of being sliced open and slicing other people open. Look, Jackass, Johnny Knoxville, those guys like to staple their balls to their thigh. They like to jump off the roof of buildings. There's people out here who like that shit. They get off on it. And it is what it is, but that sounds absolutely ridiculous. Like this guy stuck a pizza slicer in your mouth and cut your tongue for real. Not for work, but for real. That just sounds ridiculous. Then they talked about Nick Gage almost dying. Well, when he did die, the Tournament of Death, very aptly named, right? A multi-round endurance test of violence, where you have to wrestle several death matches in one day. John Moxley called this the Woodstock of wrestling. Okay, that makes sense. And he was wrestling a guy named Thumbtack Jack, a German deathmatch wrestler who had been imported specifically for this match. And Gage gets, they have the ring surrounded by fluorescent light tubes. They're in the ropes. So think barbed wire massacre or something like that, but fluorescent light tubes. So apparently these two guys have been decimated throughout the day. Uh, Thumbtack Jack throws Nick Gage through the fluorescent light tubes. One of them gets stuck under his armpit and rips at his artery, and blood just gushes out of him. Now they showed the gruesome scene of Nick Gage covered in blood, wearing a jersey, and he's bleeding pretty much to death. And then as he's on screen, he's saying, "Oh, he's trying to come up with angles to try to get back out there." He's like, "How about I try to get back out, and you guys pull me back, just so the audience can see that I really wanted to get back out there." And the nurse is like, "Nope, absolutely not. You're bleeding a lot." And he's just like, tape it up, just tape it and let me get back out there. And she's like, "No, this is dangerous." And he wants to make sure that the cameraman, who he calls Smart Mark, make sure you record that I wanted to get back out there. And he was like, I did. So because they were in an open field in the middle of nowhere in Delaware, they couldn't get an ambulance. So they had to use a helicopter. So the helicopter comes to get him, and he essentially passed out on the helicopter, and that's where he died. And he said that was the last thing he remembered. And then I guess he woke up in the hospital, and he was resuscitated by a doctor. He was dead for 7 minutes. That's what John Moxley said. He was dead for 7 minutes. And of course, this adds to the legend. And you know what? That's part of how folk heroes go. Folk heroes have these tall tales about them that are like over the top. This guy robbed a bank. He died in the ring. He stabbed David Arquette. So let's talk about him stabbing David Arquette. So he told the story of David Arquette, which is probably useful for most people. And David Arquette was on a redemption tour. That, this guy had become the WCW World Champion. It was a joke. And he thought that, I'm a legit wrestling fan. I want to earn the respect of wrestling fans. I mean, it's not too late for people to see him and say, okay, well, the guy won the world title, but now he's a legitimate wrestler, And I guess we could talk about that some other time. When I finally sit down and watch the David Arquette documentary, maybe we'll talk about it then. He was sick of being hated by wrestling fans. He was sick of being disrespected by wrestling fans. He felt, he wanted to go on a redemption tour. So he said that he wanted to take wrestling seriously. So he did. He went to a school. He got trained. He went down to Mexico. He did, he learned some real wrestling moves. And then he said that he wanted to do a death match. And then it was suggested that he do a death match with Nick Gage. He said he didn't really know who Nick Gage was, but was down to do the death match because it was something that he felt it was the right thing to get the respect that he wanted. He said he looked him up, and he said he looked at it and said, "Yeah, I could do that," and figured that he was going to do that. And then he said he contacted Brett Lauderdale, or Brett Lauderdale contacted him. They talked it out. They went to lunch in Los Angeles. David Arquette is an actor, so you're talking about this whole ordeal here, and they're having steaks and drinking martinis or some shit. And Arquette is just agreeing with everything. As Nick Gage tells him, like, this is real. Like, this is not going to be no fake shit. The glass is real. The light tubes are real. Everything is real. And Arquette's like, yeah. I get it. You're gonna do this stuff for real. I get it. To which he says, the only thing I don't want you to do is to cut me. Don't cut me. I'm an actor. Don't cut me. And he claims that Nick Gage agreed to that. Then they go into the match, in which case they went as far as they laid it in. They did the opening thing where Arquette threw a couple of bitchy punches, and then Nick Gage, being the real fighter, beat his ass. Then he says that Arquette started doing some high flying stuff, started laying his shit in. So he says, like, okay, I felt like I had to turn up the violence. So that's when he started, with the pizza cutter to Arquette. And Arquette was furious about the pizza cutter because, Nick Gage telling him, oh, you won't feel it. And, Arquette is like, we agreed that you would not cut me. Now he's cutting my head with a pizza cutter. Arquette gets pretty angry at this. He's getting pretty pissed. Then, Nick Gage takes it to the next level, bashes him overhead with a fluorescent light tube. Arquette is now very mad. He spins around, and Nick Gage just kind of naturally does, stabs him in the neck with a piece of a fluorescent light tube, I believe. And this led to the infamous picture of David Arquette holding his neck, gushing blood. And then, Nick Gage takes him down and tells him to just stay down. And Arquette stays down and gets pinned. Then he got the hell out of there. And then Nick Gage was like, oh, yeah, he was doing all right. He did good. And then he became a crybaby afterwards. And he went and jumped in Luke Perry's car, and I didn't see him since. And so they showed footage of TMZ catching up with David Arquette about this violent match. And David Arquette was not happy. And he was basically like, it was interesting. So David Arquette admitted that he was in over his head. Didn't really know that much about death matches when he did it. But he did do it. And that was all very interesting. That was all very interesting stuff. I've never seen the match with him and David Arquette. For obvious reasons, I don't watch death matches. But it seems like it's a continuous thing. Like, it sounded so much like when he was saying, like, I told him not to cut me and he did it anyway. That sounded to me almost like he was talking to New Jack. That's the only time I really got New Jack vibes from Nick Gage. Is that, you're in my world now. You're going to do what I want you to do. Like, I'm changing the rules now. And it was like, yeah, when you get in those situations, people do, and he's feeding off the crowd, this Nick Gage, he's feeding off the crowd. So when he's feeding off the crowd, who knows where he's going to go with it, because there's only so much of that shit that's actually scripted. It's not like Randy Savage or, Johnny Gargano or anything, or Kenny Omega, where you script out a whole fucking match. Certain spots are going to be scripted out, like the finish and, opening spot and stuff like that. Transitions. But you're not going to go through the entire match step by step. You're going to go off the crowd and what the crowd is reacting to and what the crowd wants. The crowd wants David Arquette fucking dead. So, and he's, if David Arquette is, the poor Christian being tossed to the lions, Nick Gage is the fucking lion. It's his job to bust you open. It's his job. That's the story that they had to be telling. What other story are you going to fucking tell? You're telling the story of David Arquette being a piece of meat being thrown to the lions. So the lions have to do what they do, And that's really what everybody wanted to see. Everybody wanted to see this actor get in there with somebody who they feel is legit, who they feel is like a superhero in a way, or, a cultural icon, and he's going to tear you to fucking shreds. That's what they wanted. What the fuck else did you expect? So even though I may naturally be on the side of Arquette, because the guy said don't cut me, at the same time, this is what you signed up for. You signed up for the pizza cutter and the fluorescent light tubes to the head and all this shit. But what bothered me is the fact that you had this guy pretty much die doing fluorescent light tubes. And then they didn't stop doing fluorescent light tubes. Now they still do it. And then they almost killed David Arquette using fluorescent light tubes, and they still do it. Like, it's absolutely absurd to me that, that's what deathmatch wrestling is now. Now, I'm not going to say the stories aren't interesting, because those are very interesting stories. All of the stuff with the death matches and shit like that. You can have a solid blood and guts type of affair to blow off a feud. But two guys who, I just met you 10 minutes ago, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, I'm hitting you in the head with a cinder block. It's like, that seems silly to me. It's cartoonish. And the fact that they do it for real is even more hilarious. Because, there has to be limitations to this shit at some point, right? So, all in all, I think the episode was very good. It was very educational for me. I learned a lot about Nick Gage. I learned a lot about the fans of Nick Gage. I just think that it's a good redemption story, I think, for the guy. I've seen a lot of people say he should have been on TV. He should have. Somebody needs to give him a contract. And I'm like, Tony Khan to do it when he gets, when he gets desperate enough, he'll throw Nick Gage a contract. Trust me. But ultimately, I don't see it that way. You talk about a 40-year-old deathmatch wrestler who's, is gotta be, he's gotta be like an insurance liability at this point. You talk about the injuries. Like, they didn't get into broken ankles, twisted arms, or whatever, which I believe Nick Gage said he hadn't had that many actual injuries. But when you talk about a guy who's been doing this for a long time, he's got to be a liability as far as trying to insure this guy, license this guy. That's got to be very, very hard. But I guess if somebody wants to put in the effort, I'm pretty sure he's far too old for Vince. It would have to be AEW or somebody like that. But I don't think he needs to be on TV anyway. If that's his audience, I mean, this whole entire thing was essentially a commercial for Game Changer Wrestling, if we're being honest, But I also believe that this kind of shit is what hipsters think wrestling is. These people think wrestling is, hitting people over the head with steel chairs because that's what they grew up watching on TV. People don't understand, like, a lot of that whole 10 people getting hit in the head with chairs every week, that shit was an aberration in the business. Guys very, very, like, guys would get into those crazy fights, the brawls, Capital Wrestling did it, and Memphis did it, and, the Sheik in Detroit, he did it. Those brawls, they were meant to be, the top guys would go out there and get juiced by, Abdullah the Butcher stabbing somebody in the head with something, and they would only do it every once in a while. It wasn't every week, twice a week ordeal, That's not what the business was. Like, the brawls are just, the wrestling has broken down into fights. Like, you would start out scientific, trying holds or whatever, and then the heel would snap, and then things would get violent. The heel would get out of control, which is typical of what happens, But that has become, pro wrestling means hit somebody in the head with a chair. And from there, you just take it like, why stop at chairs? Why not hit him in the head with a dresser drawer? Why not throw a television at his head? Why don't you? And then ECW came out and they were hitting people in the face with blueberry pies and stop signs and, car engines and some more shit. They were setting each other on fire. It was just absolutely absurd, the amount of damage they were doing to themselves. And, people idolized it and they thought it was cool. And so they started doing it too, but I can appreciate the toughness that goes into it, but that's it. I don't see the artistic merit in deathmatch wrestling. I just don't see it. But I can accept the concept of Nick Gage, folk hero, Christ-like figure, deathmatch hero who rose from the dead to lead this cult, this bloody cult of deathmatch wrestling. He's still alive and they have like tournaments and stuff named after him. He seems like a nice enough guy. I saw some videos of him, when like in his downtime, just giving fans general motivational stuff. And that's really, the good guy stuff that I like. I like that. I don't like the deathmatch wrestling and all that bullshit, but he seemed like he might be a cool uncle, and sometimes guys just need cool uncles. So while deathmatch wrestling is absolute horseshit, he might not be a bad guy as a person, and so that's pretty much that's my takeaway from this documentary. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, toss me some cash via Cash App or Subscribe Star if you please, and I'll talk to you guys later, man. Peace out.